generative AI is making up the text. And so it actually stumbles into getting a lot of it right. But it also makes mistakes. So this whole thing, you hear the controversy about hallucinations and such. What I like to say is it's all a hallucination. It's made up every answer that you see. And it's amazing to me how often it actually will get it mostly or completely right. But we should not be surprised that there's mistakes, specifically because that's what it's doing. It's making up the answers with probability.
SC Media and our sponsor Darktrace are proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, bestselling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by the 1,100 plus members of Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. Hi, I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Bill Franks, Director of the Center for Data Science and Analytics at Kennesaw State. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
So, Bill, I'm curious, what attracted you to the data science analytics area?
Yeah, I wish I had a better story, but back when I was registering for classes as a freshman in college, they said I had to pick a major, but I could change it. And I'd always liked math and science, and they had this thing called statistics. Back then, that there weren't analytics degrees or just statistics. And I remember I said, this sounds a little bit like applied math. And they said, yeah, that's probably right. So I put it down and found that I really enjoyed it. Ended up, getting my first jobs doing some analytics for initially for AT&T, then for some other companies. And I've been into it ever since. So I guess it was a little bit of luck. And then after I got that luck, I ran with it.
Well, it looks like one of us stayed with that field. And I started off as a math major, and then I was an accounting major, and then I was a business administration major, and then I got a job as a computer programmer coming out of school, and then decided I wasn't as good of a computer programmer, and then was moving into management because I figured I could lead people and went that way. But I remember a business statistics course that I took during the summertime, and I'll never forget it because it was a 16-week course crammed into 4 weeks, and we were on chapter 9 by Thursday of the first week. And so I have a lot of respect for somebody that stayed with the whole statistics field, and data science has really ballooned in the last few years, hasn't it?
Oh, massively. And the funny thing is, everyone thinks of machine learning and data science and AI as being completely removed from classic statistics, and certainly they've evolved on top of it. But even in these massive models, these large language models and these image models and stuff that you're seeing, when you dig under the hood, there's still a lot of classic statistical functions in each of, when you hear about the number of neurons in these models and all, a lot of them just have very basic statistical functions in them. So even with today's super sophisticated and new age analytics, at the same time, there's the foundational statistics underpinning all of it.
Sure. So tell us a little bit about, AI has just like blown up in the last year since, ChatGPT has made its way mainstream. So tell us, what are some of those business uses, some of the business benefits, and some of the misunderstandings that we have about AI?
Yeah, I mean, we could go on for hours on this. I'd say if I were to pick the single biggest misunderstanding that people seem to have, when you go to an image generator and you ask for some image that is fake. So I say, hey, put an image of the two of us sitting on top of a mountain, drinking a tea in a boat, some ridiculous thing. I get back an image. It'll look just like that. And we all are completely aware that that image was made up. Right? Although it looks like what I asked for, it was made up. With the language models, people forget that it's equally made up. So people will ask ChatGPT or a similar application a question, and it'll give you an answer. But what it's doing is probabilistically generating that answer word by word based on the training data. And that is fundamentally different from a Google search, for example, which is attempting, and it might do better or worse, but it's attempting to find actual links, actual articles, actual documents that talk about what you're asking about. Generative AI is making up the text. And so it actually stumbles into getting a lot of it right. But it also makes mistakes. So this whole thing, you hear the controversy about hallucinations and such. What I like to say is it's all a hallucination. It's made up every answer that you see. And it's amazing to me how often it actually will get it mostly or completely right. But we should not be surprised that there's mistakes, specifically because that's what it's doing. It's making up the answers with probability.
That's fascinating because I don't know that most people have that understanding. They think it's just like Google on steroids.
That's exactly right, and that to me is the biggest. When I talk to at a conference or to a company, that's the biggest point I like to make is you've got to understand that the algorithms by definition make it up, and so the language model somehow tricks us because the language sounds good, even though a picture, no matter how good it looks, our brains are understand that picture was fake. Now, to your other part of your question, that doesn't mean it's all bogus or it's all bad. It can be used for a lot of really good things. So, there's websites now where there might be thousands of product reviews, and what they're doing, they're using a language model to consolidate a synopsis of what's the general gist of what all these reviews are saying in one paragraph or two paragraphs. And that paraphrasing of the common themes within those reviews can be very powerful. It would save you or I a ton of time. And so, the little line I always say is you want to be careful where you use generative AI. There's plenty of places where it can help quite a bit. I just named that one, but you have to use it in cases where it's okay if different people get a slightly different answer to the same question. And it also has to be okay that sometimes not all that information will be the same, and sometimes it won't all be accurate either. And there are plenty of cases that's true, but then there's other scenarios, like I'm sitting in a hotel conference room right now. If I want to call down and ask about availability and cost for a room tonight, I don't want a probabilistic model generating an answer of what the most probable availability and room rate is. I want an actual lookup against the reservation system and give me the actual room availability and rate. And so I think that's the key. It's about, as with every other technology and tool, you got to use it appropriately for what it's good at. And people today are just trying to use it for everything. And there's a lot of places like that lookup of a room rate. It doesn't make any sense. You don't want a generated probabilistic room rate. You want to know the actual rate you pay tonight so you can reserve it.
And I've found that in asking some questions about things that I knew the answers to. I mean, I've written several cybersecurity books, and so I was looking for a list. Give me the top 10 leadership books for CISOs, and I was saying this on another podcast that it came back with the list, and I was glad to see two of my books were in there. But one of them had a different author, and it wasn't me. And I'm looking at this saying, I wrote this book. So what do you do then when you ask one of these tools that information, but you know that it's wrong? Is there a way to correct that?
Well, I mean, that's a sticky issue. So in your session, you can say, I believe that isn't the correct author. Can you double check? And then it might go dig deeper and be able to correct itself and say, I found the answer, but the catch is that doesn't necessarily mean the next person who asks it fresh won't get that. But at the same time, the chance of another person getting that exact wrong answer is pretty low also. Like I asked it some things about me for kicks, and it told me that my first book had been nominated for an award by an organization that gives out book awards for an award that sounded like one that organization would do. I had no recollection of being nominated for it, but in my head, I'm like, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it got nominated. No one ever told me because I didn't win. And then I dug around and found I couldn't find any record of said award nor my nomination for it. So this gets back to nobody's going to know my history better than myself. And it gave me a convincing enough answer that I went and dug in to validate whether I had forgotten something. Now, when you start to ask you questions about things you don't know about that you're not personally able to vet, that can be very problematic. So I always say, if you're asking a generative AI tool for answers today, you want to kind of consider it like one of those friends you have that sometimes knows some cool stuff, but can either exaggerate or just get things wrong, but says it all with confidence. It's kind of like that. You've got to verify if there's an utmost importance to a question you're asking. You need to verify that information. If you just want to know, hey, what are people generally saying about this hotel in the reviews? It's okay if it gets a few things wrong, as long as in general it's people love it, people hate it. But again, if I'm looking for some advice on how a certain part of organic chemistry works because I'm stuck on a problem on my homework, taking aside whether it's valid or not to use a tool to help you with your homework, I better not just take what it gives me verbatim and then put it in my homework. What I might do is use that as a starting point to then go do some more traditional querying and document lookup to say, hey, what else is out there, on this topic now that it's at least given me some of the terminology and code words to look for in its answer.
So there's a lot of organizations now that are looking at, we have to get on the artificial intelligence bandwagon and have AI projects inside our organizations to drive profitability. And how do we match that up with now we're using this tool that is based on data that may not give us an accurate answer or may give us different answers depending on when we ask it the question.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of work being done to resolve some of these concerns. So, for example, what I talk about is where the value is going to be for organizations is, first of all, no one's going to build a foundational language or image model because there's going to be a few large open source models. It's already true. Even the ones owned by commercial companies are all but open source. And they've spent tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to train those models. You're just going to plug in and pay per prompt. Now, the values in adding functionality on top. So when I submit a prompt, there are already add-ins you can do, wherein if I put a math question as part of my prompt, it will realize, oh, this is a math question. We don't want a generated answer. We want a computed answer, and it can pass the math component of that question over to a math engine. Maybe there's a chemistry component. We could go to a chemistry engine, and so on and so forth. We get the individual responses back from those, and then we can consolidate those. And this is where the language models would do a terrific job. Here's all these answers to the different parts of the question that Bill had. Some have been generated. Maybe if I said, what's the current room rate availability and the general review of the hotel? The general review of the hotel might go to a language model to consolidate grab the reviews off the website, and I say consolidate those. It might look up the room rate, might look up the price, then have an LLM on top of that make me a nice little paragraph or two narrative. Hey, Bill, it looks like the rate is this at this price, and according to recent reviews, the hotel's a fine place to stay. And so it's back to that idea of using the right type of query, using the right type of add-in and the right type of model for each piece of my prompt. And then on the back end, you're going to have another layer of models that pulls that all together, which, by the way, is quite complex. Everything I just said, it's easy to explain. It's going to be hard to get all that going, but I think that's where we're heading. So you'll end up with the best of all worlds. Every tool will add what it's strong at, and we'll begin to be able to isolate the tools from being used what they're not good at through the application interface. So while the model itself would give you a confident answer, I'll prevent you from having your prompt go to the language model for that portion of your answer. I'm going to intercept the prompt and pass the right pieces out to other tool sets that are better adapted for it.
To do this right, is this going to take organizations of a certain size to be able to have the right funding to do these things, or do you see this as being a low cost options coming to the market?
Well, if you want to be first, it might be a little bit expensive and you need some high powered resources. But the amazing thing is the pace of change here. I mean, already some of the big, the big vendors, as you can customize a large language model for your own organization's documentation and terminology and so forth. And it's actually relatively inexpensive to do that. And then they can house, then the language model vendor can help house those models for you and run through it. I think a lot of the kind of add-ins I'm talking about are a fairly standard type of functionality, not much different than classic application, API calls and so forth from different things. It's a close cousin to that. There's already people developing them, and I think what'll happen, like with everything else, I almost view it like an app store on your phone, right? You'll just go out, even as an enterprise, you'll say, I'll grab one of these, one of these, one of those, and out on the cloud, you can just plug and play the different pieces of functionality. And so I think if you want to be the very first one, it could be quite expensive. But as people solve each of the individual types of problems, I think that it'll end up being available cheaply, so that if you just want to be a close follower, I don't think you'll be that far behind time wise, and I don't think it'll cost you that much cost wise either.
What do you see as some of the biggest risks to organizations in adopting this?
Well, I think a lot of it, when I know you focus on security, it happened in the early days, and we've already had adaptation for this. But the early days, if you put information in the prompt, it would get maintained by that language model vendor, and then you had examples of large companies having very sensitive information getting leaked out on the other end when other people prompted the models. And so, of course, what they end up doing, like OpenAI, for example, added where you can pay for a corporate version where your information won't get included for anyone else outside your organization. So there's ways to fix it. But the thing is, it's so new. How many other ways are there that information could leak or it could be used inappropriately? I don't think anybody's figured it all out. So I think it's a matter of being very intentional and cautious in how you roll it out in a large organization to make sure that the people you're giving it to have some guardrails that you're enforcing. And then you're also monitoring to see when they do unexpected things, as they will, are the unexpected things people have come up with that maybe should be blocked by additional guardrails. And I think it's going to be an ongoing, just like with, virus software and other things, it's going to be an ongoing thing of people will get creative for ways around your guardrails. You need to not only be always putting in the new guardrails, but identifying when people bypass it. Mm-hmm. And then it can be even simple things, code generators. People, you have a code generated by one of these tools. You got to make sure people are double checking it, very carefully. But I've had a conversation today with someone about the idea of, having people do a request for a query, and the query gets generated based on the data model, and that's great. But then you have to add the security layer on that. So it might generate me a generic query to show me the total sales, but I only have permission possibly to see certain regions of sales or certain products of sales. And I may not have put that in my spoken query. So the core model might come back with a query that would accurately do it, but it provide information I can't. So you have to have, back to having add-ins, you have to have some other kind of process that'll say, here's this query that generative AI developed. Now let's look up Bill's current permissions. Oh, he's only allowed to see products A and B in the East region. This doesn't have a where clause enforcing that. We're going to add that onto the query so he only sees those products and regions. Then that query can be submitted. And so I think there's just a lot of things to think through as people use these things. And of course, your database engine should already be enforcing that, where even if I submitted the query without those filters, it might kick it back independent of the fact I submitted, and you'll say, well, Bill, you don't have permission to run this because you don't have the proper authority. But I think there's just all these interactions between these different protocols and systems that we have that'll just take some time to figure out. And so I think it's just a matter of people on a security team not being so tight that no one can innovate, but also keeping a close eye on things, as I think is always the case. But I think here it might be even a little more urgent to allow both ends of that.
And I think that's the struggle in the conversations right now with chief security officers is, what guardrails should really be in place that, that we're seen as supporting that innovation in organizations, yet at the same time not just putting everything at risk. Are there some core guardrails that really should be in place at this point of maturity?
I think the biggest thing is to recognize that obviously regulations and laws have not caught up with what's possible, and so it's really anticipating what laws are reasonable to be coming down the pike. So not just our security as it exists within the law today, but thinking ahead and making sure you're putting in place more general frameworks where, as laws do pass, you think you'll be able to adapt quickly. So as we're speaking today, it was just this past weekend that the EU passed the first version of their AI regulations. And as with everything, a lot of last minute negotiations. I'm sure there's some unintended consequences and pieces. It'll get adjusted, but I think there are some things that fundamentally people are tending to agree on in the U.S. and Europe, that it's in this legislation. If you look at the things being proposed, I think most companies would be able to identify reasonably this, and this is likely to happen. And even if it wasn't regulated, they're probably good things to do. So let's just go ahead and do those now from the beginning, so we don't have to, re-architect all kinds of stuff down the road. I think that's even more important here, just because things are moving so fast. And if you wait for all the laws before you do anything, of course, you're probably going to be way too behind. So I think in the current environment, it's kind of a self-regulated model. Just really follow what other companies are doing and what seems plausible in the law, so you can self-regulate. I guess I'll use the word, effectively and reasonably. Reasonably meaning that you're not going to be far off from what's mandated in the end anyway.
Mm-hmm. So are we going to have to map all these different laws? Because I know there's the EU law, and then the US has come out with some things, and we have NIST that has been putting some guidance together. We have different organizations that are trying to get a handle on this. Is there anything common that you're seeing in any of these laws right now that we should be addressing?
Well, I think they're all going to have some component of what kind of information is fair to use and not fair to use. They're all going to have, in terms of the input, the training data, they're all going to have some type of language around if you've leaked one way or another private information. Again, this gets back to, if your company's using let's say renting per se a large language model from a major vendor, and you incorporate your data with it, but some of customers' private data leaks out even internally, right? You might have one customer service agent using it and another customer service. If something leaks, you may end up being liable for that. So I think, there's these common threads of things that are, that's back to what I'm saying, easily foreseeable. So you're really going to want to make sure that information that's in there that is sensitive is somehow either not entered in the first place in the training, or there's some kind of checks on the back end of the output that comes, so that it can be modified prior to being released if it appears there's something in it. And of course, no procedure will be perfect, but I think if you can get it to where it's several nines, like a system uptime, several nines of not letting things out, I think you'll end up on the clean side of of both the public opinion as well as whatever regulations come down the pike. And then people will publish what they did that worked and didn't work, and you can go pick up on those protocols also to enhance your own.
Do you think bias is a big concern with these tools?
Well, yeah, I think AI in general, of course, when you go back, there's the famous cases like facial recognition algorithms having issues, or, even text. A lot of the language models, of course, have been English based, for example, and so it's catching up rapidly with other languages and such. But there certainly is bias, and I always point out to people, when you hear about bias, people immediately jump to the very visible and let's say from a societal perspective, unacceptable bias, racial, gender, et cetera, et cetera. But remember that bias is a mathematical term, and all bias means really is that group A is somehow getting a different answer than group B, where we don't think they should be. And so it's these little nuanced biases where maybe, it's not any of those sensitive areas, but the way you've trained your model, it's a little more likely to recommend path A for a customer than path B, even though they're equally good. Is that a problem or not? It may be that you're fine with either one, but what if it's recommending to call the call center rather than go on chat, when the call center is going to cost you 3x, right? You might want to find a way to tweak it. So I think it's oftentimes those what I'll call the mathematical bias, the hidden bias that really you wouldn't think about, that maybe doesn't matter. One example I just talked about this morning with someone, there was a great article in a journal around the single banana problem. The gentleman asked for a single banana casting a shadow on a gray background, and it took him massive numbers of iterations to even get any images that had a single banana. It was always a couple of bananas in a bunch. And his point was, well, a lot of people tagging images might have just put banana. Like, for no matter how many bananas it was, it's like, oh, that's apple, that's banana, that's pear, meaning the type of fruit. And the models couldn't distinguish one from others. Now, that's a pretty trivial problem day to day. None of us would care about the bias towards always showing multiple bananas, not a single banana. But that concept is very transferable to something about your business you might ask, where suddenly the model's getting something that's mostly right, but has a very important nuance that's off that can cause pain. Now, if you find that article, they've since adjusted the models so that you can get a single banana, right? It's almost like the problem was turned up, someone adjusted the model. But it's those, I think that's the thing that people have to be ready for. It's not just looking for the really obvious bias things that people are highly concerned about. It's also just understanding that there's patterns. It's statistically based, and you could end up with a slight bias towards certain answers or others for reasons that aren't well understood, but that could be harmful.
Yeah, I had heard about one large organization that was looking back at trying to figure out what kind of applicants would be the best performers in their workforce, and so they loaded it with the last 10 years worth of data, and then they applied that towards the applications that were coming in. But the bias that was there that wasn't pre-thought of was that most of the people that they had hired were young white males. And so when the model was then turned towards the applicants coming in, that's where the bias was, that it wasn't intended to look for that, but that's what their past history had showed that they were hiring. So we have to be conscious of those things.
Well, I'll tell you, a more innocent version of that could be real simple. Let's say you're a growing company and you're based in Atlanta, right? I'm from Atlanta. And all I've ever done is hire from Atlanta thus far because we were small, but we were growing and we're getting up to hundreds or thousands of people. And I want to start opening new offices. Well, guess what's going to happen? It's a very similar thing. This gets to a more discrete bias that has a very good grounding in the historical data, which is, well, we almost always tended to have our best employees having come from the Atlanta area because that's where we were. That's all we hired. So now I want to open an office in Chicago. I'm getting applicants from Chicago, but they're getting downgraded compared to an applicant from Atlanta simply because historically we overwhelmingly hired people from Atlanta. And it might have even been a stronger pattern than simply they got hired. We might have been purposely not hiring people from Chicago because we didn't want to pay relocation and so forth. And so the data could pick up on that. And unless you put it to context, we now actually want Chicago, we want people local to the market. We don't want you to follow just the historical pattern. And again, that one I just gave you, once I explain it, you could see and it makes sense and you would know how to work around it. The point is these models at any point in time could have a very similar phenomenon happening that you may not have thought about or recognized yet. And that's where you have to be, you have to be on the lookout. And I'd say, again, as security, from a security and a corporate policy perspective, I could see even having potentially like a little hotline. If you think you've seen something that these models are doing that's not making sense to you, that you think something, just report it. Tell us the context of what you were doing and why. Send us the output, and we'll see if we can figure out. Yeah, this does make sense. What you see does appear to be a bias in our model, and you put in a request to try and tune the model differently, or you publish to people, you need to add this context to a prompt when you're asking about, reviewing resumes.
That's a fascinating idea. I mean, we have corporate ethics hotlines. Why not have a hotline like that? I think that's a great idea. Well, this has been great. We could talk for quite a while, and I think we're just at the beginning of where we're going with all this. Clearly, what sort of a final advice would you give to emerging chief security officers, current chief security officers, new, experienced? As they're trying to, get their arms around AI and support their businesses while at the same time mitigate the risk?
Yeah, I'd say, back to it. You're not going to be able to stop this. I mean, the other thing is in theory, you could, completely ban it at the corporate level, which a few companies have tried to do. Guess what? People kind of find a way around that anyway. And then you risk, alienating and losing people. So you're going to have to let some of this go. But for example, I would run, you could pretty freely run prototypes for internal users for internal purposes, because even if something bleeds out that ought not, at least it's within the family per se, right? So if we wanted to test whether or not sensitive customer information could leak, we could let people ask questions, in prototype, ask about other employees and validate that nothing leaks about those employees. Now, I might learn, maybe I'm able to learn something about you that I otherwise wouldn't from an HR file, as long as it's not hypersensitive. That's a lot, that's better than a customer learning something about another customer who don't have the affiliation. So you could do, start with prototyping with a group of people who all understand that they could have information exposed to each other. And the whole point is to see if you can trick it into exposing information about each other. Then you could roll it, to more broadly within the company and get feedback and monitor. And eventually then you might say, now we can take the same concept and we feel comfortable doing some outward facing stuff, with initially some very tight monitoring and maybe a low scale rollout. And then eventually you might turn it on. I don't think that process I just laid out there is necessarily fundamentally different from other things, but I think it's different in terms of some of the specifics in how you would design those prototypes and those experiments, and the level of sophistication of some of the, like those initial users in particular, where you're asking them to, instead of break our firewall, right? You ask people to come in and attack and hack through the firewall. You're saying, I need some people who are going to try and break our data privacy protections within the language model and leak information. I think it's the same kind of principles and concepts that you can transfer from other parts of security, where you need some good actors who are trying to do bad things on purpose, and then once you're confident that it's really hard for even someone who knows what they're doing to do a bad thing, you can begin to release it further.
Sure.
Much like you do with your outward facing apps in general behind the that are in front of and behind the firewall.
I think that's great advice. Thanks a lot. Thanks for taking the time today, Bill.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. We want to say a special thank you to Darktrace. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.